Welcome to the podcast of the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. What kind of person do you expect to get into heaven? This week we learn that Jesus has a confronting idea about his guest list. And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. Luke chapter 5 verses 26 to 32 is what we're looking at today. And the question we start with is this: what would spoil a party? I mean, imagine a dinner party, and as it's going on, everyone's having a great time around the table, but then just imagine you start to notice a bit of a disturbance at the other end of the table. Voices are starting to rise, and not really in a friendly way. And one of the people involved in that conversation, which is getting a bit louder and uncomfortable, is your host. And all the other conversations around the table start to die down a bit. And then the host says very loudly, "If that's really your political position, then you will have to leave this table and my house immediately." And the person and their wife get up and they leave the table and leave the house and leave the party. And you can imagine that after that, people might try and get back to the other conversations, but the party's never really going to recover. Now, the part of the Bible, Luke's account of Jesus' life that we're looking at today, is a party that shocked religion. The people there have a similar reaction as the host I just spoke about, but their reaction is not to a conversation or to an unpopular opinion. Their reaction is to the guest list. And we will see in this that Jesus' priorities are what shape his activities. And in turn, that shapes his work schedule, it shapes his diary, it shapes how he spends his time and who he spends his time with. And what we find there, if we read this properly, is truly very offensive. It's offensive because our priorities are so often very different to Jesus' priorities. And so our activities are different, and how we spend our time is different, and who we spend it with is different. So let's get into this passage. And actually, before we get into the verses itself, we need to really see the context in which this is happening, because Levi's call in verse 27 is not just an isolated story. It's a story that flows directly from everything Luke's been showing us about Jesus so far. You'll remember in chapters 1 to 3 of Luke, he introduces us to who Jesus is. It's like he gives us his CV. But then in Luke's 4 to 6, where we are at the moment, Luke is telling us why Jesus came. The section began really in Luke chapter 4, verse 15. And it centres on Jesus' manifesto that he talks about in 4 verse 18 and following. It's a manifesto that he takes from Isaiah and what Isaiah said about what the Messiah would do. And Jesus says that he is the Spirit-anointed Messiah that Isaiah talked about, who has come to proclaim good news to the spiritually poor. Now, crucially, he has not come to judge, well, not yet. And the fact that he hasn't come to be the judge of other people is something that offends those who are in the religious establishment. They want condemnation of everyone except themselves, of course. But instead, Jesus is the one who brings grace, and so what they do is they try to murder him in chapter 4, verse 29. And as we move through these chapters, two things become clear. Jesus' word has authority, and it is his priority to proclaim it. But then what is his purpose? Well, in Luke chapter 5, we see it clearly. He has come to summon sinners. You remember Peter comes and falls at Jesus' feet saying, "I am a sinful man." And then Jesus replies, the amazing words, "Do not be afraid." And in the key statement in Luke chapter 5, verse 24, he says, "The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." That is the focus of Jesus' mission. And so we are not surprised that the very next story is this account of Levi. It is not a standalone little story to get a moral for life. It is Luke ramming home his key point. He wants us to know who Jesus is and what kind of person he's come for. And that means this moment is not marginal. This is a central story, and it's likely to be offensive. But if we do find ourselves to be offended, that has a very serious sting to it. So now, having seen the context, let's have a look at Levi in verse 27. After Jesus, went out, he saw the tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And leaving everything, he rose and followed him. And Levi made him a great feast in his house, and there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at the table with him. Now, with a name like Levi, I think it's right to think that he probably is from the tribe of the Levitical priests of Israel. His proper place and role was to be in the temple as a Levitical priest. In verse 30, we find that there are others mentioned, and in verse 29, these others we find include Pharisees and scribes. Now, in Israel, during the Roman occupation of the first century, the time at which this is occurring, tax collectors were seen by their countrymen, like the religious people, as traitors, morally bankrupt and spiritually bankrupt. They were people working for the foreign occupying Roman forces against who are oppressing the Jewish people, and they are taking taxes for the enemy. They also had a reputation, these tax collectors, for being corrupt, for taking more tax than was required and then keeping a good margin for themselves when they passed it on to the Roman authority. Now, the Roman authority didn't care at all that they did this as long as the money kept coming in. So tax collectors were also largely regarded as being crooked, bankrupt in their morals. Tax collectors were also unclean because they worked for the Romans. They worked for Gentiles. Tax collectors were spiritual and moral outcasts. But while Levi was outcast by some of the nationalistic, religious-minded people, it's also good to bear in mind that Levi was also a part of a particular in-crowd. He clearly is a man of substantial wealth, and there's a number of people in Jerusalem, Jewish people, who were actually at the time quite comfortable with the rule of Rome. I mean, Rome was allowing them to have their temple worship. They weren't required to worship Caesar, and they invested in the infrastructure, and Rome has been keeping the peace quite well, and it created a situation where many could actually make a good living. And so Levi was not just alone. He wasn't only an outcast. There was a group of people who were like Levi and quite happy with the situation. And so we find in verse 29, he's able to throw a party. And when he throws a party, it's a popular party. There are people around who go to it. The word for banquet that is used there is a grand reception. Something like a wedding feast is something that he throws here. So even if he is an outcast to some, even if he's an outcast to the religious, even if he's an outcast to those who are more nationalistic in their mindset, Levi also, in another group of people, was popular, and he knew how to throw a party. If you got an invitation to his place and you weren't too religious, it was a great way to get ahead in the world, as long as you didn't take religion too seriously. So this man Levi, the son probably of a priestly class, he's a man of privilege. He's a man actually from a God-fearing home, but he's thrown that away to work for the enemy. He's a man, he does exploit his countrymen to gain money for himself. He is morally and spiritually adrift. His chosen occupation does declare him to be a part of the other side. Levi knew it just as well as the religious establishment knew it. Okay. Levi, in his tax booth, maybe he's got the early trip in from his villa on Lake Tiberias. He's gone in early maybe to avoid the traffic. He likes to get in early so he can get the admin out of the way so he can plan his day. Maybe it's been a tough year. There's a bit of a recession going on, and the government is cutting his margins, but he's still got to sustain his lifestyle, and he's got a family to feed maybe and children to educate. He's got a mortgage to pay off, and there's the summer holiday coming up, and maybe there's some rumours going around of a new religious figure in Galilee, and so Levi thinks to himself, I hope he doesn't interfere with my revenues. Maybe someone in the office has been talking about this figure Jesus. They'd asked Levi to come and hear Jesus speak, and that made Levi chuckle a bit, maybe. He'd even joked about it with some of his mates. Didn't she have any idea about what his private life was like? Levi hanging around with the God Squad. Can you imagine that? And anyway, Levi knew that this Jesus wanted absolutely nothing to do with him, and so Levi set out for his office to a nearby street, and he set up his booth just outside the synagogue, where it seemed like a large crowd's gathered. Is this going to be good for business? And then there he is, standing right opposite Levi in the street. And as he gazed at Levi, it seemed that this person looking at him knew everything about him. He knew his language. He knew about maybe his failing marriage or his temper or the one-night stand at the office party. And his greed, his vicious self-promotion. And above it all, behind it all, his refusal to give God any space in his life. And then this person just says two words, follow me. And to his absolute amazement, he finds himself getting up. Actually, that is the same word as has just been used to describe the paralytic in the previous story getting up to walk. And Levi likewise gets up and starts following Jesus. That's the first point of this section. Jesus' priority governs his activity. What Jesus does makes actually complete sense in the context of what Jesus has come into the world to do. Jesus' authority on earth is an authority to forgive sins, and therefore he goes and summons sinners. Let me just drop in here a couple of things that you might want to take away and consider. First, to the person who says, well, do you know this Christian business, that could never be about me? I could never really involve myself in that kind of stuff. Or maybe it's thinking about the Christian who says, do you know, I've just discovered I'm so rotten to the core, I can't really believe that Jesus would have any time for me. Now, one of the things about Christian life is that sometimes it takes us by surprise. Sometimes we thought we were doing okay, and then suddenly we realize that we are more rotten than we thought we were. And sometimes you'll find you've done something or thought something, and you realize that rottenness goes deep inside. And if that's you, notice how reassuring the very real Jesus is as we realize this. Jesus, the Saviour of the world, comes to a person who knows their rottenness and says to that rotten person, follow me. He's come to save sinners. What good news that is. If you're not yet a Christian and you're starting to realize that things between you and God are not right, hear what Jesus says to people who are like you. He says to you, follow me. If you are a Christian and you've just stumbled badly and you're wondering whether Jesus really still will take you, Jesus comes to sinners and he says, follow me. A second thing for us to consider, to the person who says, yes, I'll follow Jesus, but only if you know there's a little part of my life that I feel I really need to hang on to, that I want to keep as mine. I'll follow Jesus, but only if... Did you notice Levi's response in verse 28? Leaving everything, he rose and followed him. Does that mean we have to give up absolutely everything, leave everything, sell my house, leave my job, risk all the comfort and that of my family? Well, what if the answer was yes? I mean, it might be. It could be that the work that you are doing, there are situations like Levi is in, where the work that you're doing is incompatible with Christian faith. That's probably not describing any of us on the call, but it could be that the way you are doing your work is incompatible with Christian faith, and the way that you've set it up and set yourself into the role that you're doing is so incompatible that you cannot continue in it. And maybe there are some people who would have to, by following Jesus, step away from something as significant as that. We are speaking here of an encounter with the Spirit-anointed King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the ruler of the universe, and he says, "Follow me." Now, not every disciple has to leave behind absolutely everything, but every disciple uses everything from now on, knowing that it is no longer theirs to do what they want with. Absolutely everything is now devoted for the purpose of the one that they now recognize is the Lord and their Lord. But for Levi, his tax business represented his rebellion against God. And so when Jesus said, "Follow me," he got up and he left it all behind and followed. Just stop with me and apply that to what we call the idea of career. I just wonder whether the idea of having a career is really compatible with Christian thinking. We talk about having a career a lot, but when you become a Christian, your career is now to follow Jesus, isn't it? Isn't that what you are called to above all else? Well, just one third thing to think of before we move on, and that's to those of us who might say, I can never imagine that person or that person or that person ever becoming a Christian. Have you ever found yourself thinking that? When you're thinking about evangelism, and maybe you think, well, there's that relative or that friend or that colleague who pops into mind, and you think, oh, they're just beyond the pale. There's no way, never in a million years could I imagine them becoming a Christian. And so, because we think that, we don't really ever try to share the gospel with them. But friends, do you see that that person who we can't imagine in a million years is the kind of person that this man Levi is? And if I begin to say I won't bother speaking of Jesus to them, what I'm actually doing is doubting the power of Jesus. So just think for a second, who is the person in your sphere of relationships that maybe you have excluded from the possibility of sharing Jesus with? And just see, that's Levi. That's the person Jesus went to. And so great is the power of Jesus' word that when he decides to take the initiative and summon somebody like that to himself, they cannot do anything but rise and follow him. Well, I wonder if when we first looked at the verses back in chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, I'll remind you of the words, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He's sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. And when we went over that a couple of weeks ago, I said those definitions are not primarily about the marginalised and impoverished of our society. It's not a call to social action. That's what some people might be tempted to. And when I said that, some people might have been tempted to say, well, Cameron, it seems you're twisting things to make your application a little bit more comfortable. Cameron, that means you don't have to devote yourself to social change in this world. That means that you don't have to give your money to causes. And if you just look those verses by themselves, then you might be right to level that accusation at me. But if we look at what Luke is showing us about Jesus' priorities and about his activity, we see that Jesus thinks Isaiah is talking about things that set his priorities and driving Jesus' activity. And what do we see Jesus doing? We see him going to the spiritual outsiders. We go to those who are symbolic of sin's curse on the world. We see that he's going directly to the open and notorious rebel against God. Jesus' activity is directed with all God's authority to the activity of addressing sinfulness. And as he comes out, probably from the synagogue, Jesus says to the sinner, "Follow me." Jesus' priority governs his activity. And now we see that his activity shapes his daily diary. It shapes his agenda. Levi's party has rocked the religious establishment, and in verses 30 to 31 we find a revealing reaction. Follow carefully. And if any of us are offended and surprised or taken back by Jesus' activity, then we need to be very careful, because if we're offended or surprised by his activity, we're finding ourselves distant from Jesus himself. And if we reveal that we don't understand Jesus, we actually are showing that we're not understanding ourselves either. Look at verse 30. The Pharisees and the scribes grumbled at Jesus, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus answered them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call," and you could put in here the self-righteous. "I have not come to call those who see themselves as righteous. I've come to call sinners to repentance." Remember that the Pharisees are the same group who were there in the synagogue that Saturday checking Jesus out, like the teaching inspectorate or of the Department of Education sending their inspectors to assess the teacher. Things are already looking pretty dicey in the report that they're preparing. They've objected to Jesus' blasphemous claim to be able to forgive sinners. Now, this group of people called the Pharisees, they're mostly lay people. They're not religious professionals. They are lay people, however, who are immensely religious in their behaviour and attitude. Many of the Pharisees were businessmen, upstanding members of the community, part of what we would call a church council. They were often wealthy. They were often generous in their charity work. They are upstanding members of the establishment as well as society. The other group of people listed here, the teachers of the law, well, they are the professional theologians. They're the ones who instructed people how to keep God's law. And this rabbi has got his name about. There have been some miracles. He's bringing some kind of change. And now they've seen some of the miracles themselves. They've seen with their own eyes the miracle of the paralyzed man getting up and walking. And now this Jesus accepts an invitation to a great dinner in Levi's house, along with the morally bankrupt. The other day here in Dublin, we had a visiting bishop come and speak to us. Just imagine after church he accepted an invitation to go to a party with a corrupt and immoral businessman. And at the table are those who everyone knows are really dodgy, but they've got enough cash to fiddle things so that they get away with it. And there is the celebrity at the party who just the other day boasted of having her third abortion. And there's that porn actress who's just broken the record for how many people they've had sex with in the 24 hours. It's no surprise, is it, that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law are offended by the kind of company that Jesus is keeping. But Jesus' reply is brilliant. And it's also directly in line with the priority that sets his agenda. If his priority is to summon sinners, then where is he going to spend his time? So, verse 31, it's not those who are well who have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I've not come to call the self-righteous. I've come to call sinners to repentance. Now that's very revealing, isn't it? Because if I am a kind of person who doesn't see myself as poor or blind or enslaved or oppressed, if I don't see myself as a sinner but see myself as righteous, if I distance myself from that priority of Jesus, then what I'm doing is distancing myself from the real Jesus. If I start to think that the people that Jesus came for were the economically poor and I'm not one of them, then I'm starting to say I'm not one of the people that Jesus has come for. I don't really need Jesus. Now that's a bit of a challenging sting, isn't it? Jesus' illustration drives this home in verse 31. Jesus answered them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, only the sick." Where are you likely to find a surgeon plying their trade? Where are they going to be able to make money? It's not by setting up shop in a gym where people are healthy. If they set themselves up in a gym, they might get an emergency to deal with, but they won't make a living there. It'd be foolish to sit up there. A doctor spends their time with the sick. That's their job. And so Jesus says, here is my priority on earth. I am the divine physician. I have come with God's authority to summon sinners and to deal with their sin. So where am I going to spend my time? I'm going to spend my time with sinners. But then that becomes very revealing. Because if we start to say, well, I'm not one of those kind of people, I'm not one of those sinners, I'm distancing myself from Jesus' agenda. And if I'm distancing myself from Jesus' agenda, then I'm distancing myself from Jesus himself. Again, let's pause and consider a couple of areas that should make us stop and think about this passage and how it applies to us. First, in this passage, notice the extraordinary and glorious grace of God in Jesus. I love the hymn, "And Can It Be?" Do you know it? And can it be? Died he for me who caused his pain, for me who him to death pursued? Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, shouldst die for me? Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, shouldst die for me? If you see yourself as a sinner, desperately in need of God's forgiveness, is this not a wonderfully glorious thing that he's come for you? That is why he left heaven, for you and for me. And follow me, he says. It is wonderful. And the more we are honest with it about ourselves, and the more we study Scripture and find out the truth about ourselves, the more wonderful it becomes that Jesus has come for me. But secondly, here's something beyond us individually, something about Christians as we gather together, as we go to church. The church is going to be made up of the most unlikely people. And you'll be looking around and you'll think, my goodness, are they here? Is that really Levi here? If the church is full of Levis, In public life, people are so terrified, aren't they, that people might know what they've done in the past and it might destroy their career. But the church is filled with people with all kinds of backgrounds. Church is full of people who we would not otherwise choose to spend our time with. And if you've ever begun to think that you prefer not to go to church because the people there aren't your type, that is quite revealing about how you think about yourself, isn't it? Doesn't it start to suggest that you're a bit more like the Pharisees and the teachers of the law than is really comfortable? After all, if Jesus had called them, who are you to say that you're not welcome? If Jesus has called Levi, who are you to say that Levi is not welcome? Are you saying that you don't really belong with the kind of people that Jesus calls? Are you saying that you don't really need the kind of help that Jesus is offering? One of my favourite authors on this kind of thing is a man called Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was killed by the Nazis in a concentration camp. And he says, God hates visionary dreaming about church. It makes the dreamer proud and pretentious. The man who fashions a visionary ideal of community demands that that vision be realized by God and by others and by himself. And he enters into the community of Christians with his demands and sets up his own law, and he judges the brethren and God himself accordingly. And he therefore stands adamant, a living reproach to everyone else in that circle of brothers. That person acts as if he is the creator of the Christian community, as if his dreams are what binds men together. And when things do not go his way, he calls the effort a failure. When his ideal picture is destroyed, he sees the community going to smash. And so he becomes first the accuser of his brothers, and then an accuser of God, and finally a despairing accuser of himself. Oh, friends, let's not put up rules about who we want to be part of the church community. And if we start to find ourselves offended that person is at church with us, what I'm doing is I'm revealing something of my own self-righteous heart. And I'm starting to deny that I'm a sick person needing forgiveness. But for those of us who do recognize our deep need of Jesus, we look around at church, we look around at the Dublin Bible Talks, and we rejoice that God does not call people according to the categories that I hold, but by the primary category that really matters. Sinners who need to be saved. People like me, and people like you, and people like we work with, even the ones we find deeply annoying, even those we find reprehensible. Those are the sick who desperately need the doctor. Those are the dead in their trespasses and sins. Those are the ones for whom Jesus has come. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks. That's bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks.